But what we do know is that all the achievements of both ancient and modern science have been made by explicitly rejecting the theistic view that God has a hand in the universe, and that religion, if it ever did inspire scientific research, doesn't do so any longer. I maintain, though I can't prove this, that had there been no Christianity, if after the fall of Rome atheism had pervaded the Western world, science would have developed earlier and be far more advanced than it is now. All religion has done was inspire a few famous scientists to do their work. Its inimical effects on science were far more serious. Dr. Jerry Coyne. Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 49. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. We're going to explore a little bit of Dr. Coyne's this post that he wrote back in 2013. And what we're going to be really digging more into are some of the myths and lies that are often told in the name of atheism. And they really promote this idea of there being a war between science and Christianity, when in fact, when you look at the history, it's actually the exact opposite. And so some of these lies, some of these, let's call them myths for today's show, are actually myths that even I find that I have believed in the past, and that other believers probably uh, think are true as well, because they are repeated so often that you think that they're true. So you look at what Dr. Coyne says here, and when I call him a doctor here, he is a biology professor. So a doctor like I'm a doctor, a PhD, not an MD. But here he says, we know that the achievements of both ancient and modern science have been made by explicitly rejecting the theistic view that God has a hand in the universe. So again, if we think about that very first statement that he makes in this article, he is saying that we know this, that anything that has been achieved in ancient and modern science has been made by rejecting the idea that God has a hand in the universe. Now, I think what he means by this is the idea of supernatural occurrences ever occurring, and not that the supernatural is something that maybe can occur in rare instances. He's saying that you have to believe that there is never anything supernatural happening, I believe is what he's getting at here. And then he says that religion, if it ever did inspire scientific research, doesn't do so any longer. So again, just just step on the toes of all the scientists and researchers out here that are believers, is what he does here. Then he says, really, to me, the operative statement, which is, I maintain, though I can't prove this, that had there been no Christianity, if after the fall of Rome, atheism had pervaded the Western world, science would have developed earlier and be far more advanced than it is now. This is the crucial statement, because this is really what often atheists and materialists get at. They downplay the role of Christianity in the rise and really the origins of ancient and modern science. They completely downplay it. And then they do this revisionist history thing. You might call it historical fiction, where they say, well, if atheism had been there instead, then things would have gone much better, because atheism and materialistic perspectives have been what have really driven the achievements of modern science. Now, what we're going to do is, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to look at a specific research paper that I came across and a podcast. I'll talk to you a little bit about the author of the research paper and how he went on a podcast with Casey Luskin uh, back earlier this year, or at least the recording was released earlier this year. We'll look at his response to part of what Dr. Coyne has to say here. But again, one of the things I want to point out here is that if you look at some of the claims that are being made by Dr. Coyne, who has written a book, Why Evolution is True. I cite his book repeatedly in my own book, because when I'm wanting to talk about things from the perspective of an atheist or from an evolutionist, I want to actually use their own words, to use their own language. And for it, one of the things I point out, if you read Dr. Coyne's book, one of the things he talks about is the apparent design in nature. And he has a different explanation of it than I do. But one of the things I like to point out is that even someone who believes, who has a website here that's called Why Evolution is True, even someone like this can see that there's apparent design in nature. Now we come to different conclusions as to how that design comes about, but he's at least willing to concede this. And so there are several other quotes that I took that I take from his book as well. So the title of his article is Did Christianity and Other Religions Promote the Rise of Science? Now, his answer is no. He says the first sentence is, of course, most of you will answer no way. So again, his readers, those who are atheists or materialists, are going to say, no way, there's no way that happened. And so what he does then is he says that accommodationists and science-friendly believers make this argument. And he gives several quotes from that, but he does really nothing to make the claim that to really corroborate the claim that he has, which is that no, Christianity specifically and religion in general has nothing to do with the rise of science. And so one of the things he mentions here is that it is asserted, as many people often do, myself included, that if you look at people like Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, Maxwell, that these people were believers. And we stand on the shoulders of giants, of course. And when you look at the scientific giants of the past, they're basically all Christians, or they're all people who believed in the God of the Bible. And so what happens is he has to do something with that. And one of the things he says is that he mentions how basically religion and Christianity impedes science or goes against it. Now, never mind that all of those guys that did all of these have all of these discoveries and all of this great science that's been done that continues to this day. Never mind that those guys were believers. What he continues to say is that it really is a hindrance. Belief is a hindrance to science. And so he says he has several responses here. I don't want to go through all of them, but one of the things he says right off the bat is that even if this was true, which it is actually, and we're going to show that, but it is true that science came from Christianity. He says even if it were, it doesn't support the true claims of Christianity. And that would be true. Like, that's correct. Just because science did come from believers doesn't mean that Christianity in and of itself must be true. We have to actually examine Christianity to make sure it's true. But it's interesting that that would be the first thing. What would that have to do with anything? Well, in his case, he's anticipating that the believer will say, well, there's a reason why modern science came from people who were believers, and that is because Christianity itself is based on truth. So that's true. The next thing he says, and this is where we're going to go over to the research paper next. The next thing Dr. Coyne says is Christianity was around for a millennium without much science being done. "Quote unquote modern science really started as a going concern in the 17th century. Why did that take so long if Christianity was so important in fostering science?" Now, this is where he is just incorrect. He's not a historian of science, clearly, because he would not say that if he were. All of these things that he's saying are claims that, as he mentions at the very end, he says, "I maintain, though I can't prove this." Now, it's very interesting for someone who says that they're really scientifically minded to make these claims about history, and he essentially makes this fundamental conclusion that really what would have been better off is if there had been atheists doing the science in the past. The problem that he has is that science rose out of people who were Christians, people who were believers. And so this idea of kind of doing a revisionist history where what you really needed was some atheists and they would have came up with science. The problem is that atheists didn't come up with science. And so what we're going to see is that even someone like him, who is a biology professor in a university, well, universities are an invention of believers. And so what happens is, and this is the case in many and much of this discussion is that you have atheists that are building on top of foundations that were built by people who were believers, and then ridiculing those people and then saying, well, if what we really should have had is some atheists to do this. But the thing is, atheism didn't come up with any of this. It is piggybacking off of the work that's been done in the past by people who believed in God. And now you have so many universities, which is a Christian invention, universities that are now uh, overrun by people who do not believe in God at all. So it's a really ironic thing. And so the very universities that these people are operating out of is something that was started by people who believed in God, who believed in Jesus Christ. And yet these people are now saying, well, what we needed was just some atheists back there. And apparently atheists would have come up with universities and atheists would have come up with science. It's just that that's not what happened. It's believers that came up with it. So what we want to, so what I want to do next is show you this podcast. If you're interested in things related to intelligent design and let's say evolution, atheistic evolution, and kind of the war between those, because that's really where the war is. The war is between intelligent design and evolution. The war is not between science and design or science and Christianity. That's not where the war is. And so, one of the things we'll be talking about today, as we look at Dr. Key's paper, is that the war is actually more so between atheism and science than it is between science and Christianity. There is no conflict between science and Christianity. There's conflict between atheism and materialism and Christianity. And that's the issue, that these people conflate the two. So if you're interested in listening to roughly, it's a 32-minute podcast where Dr. Casey Luskin, who is affiliated with the Discovery Institute, he interviews Dr. Michael Keyes. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at Dr. Keyes' paper here. And the name of that paper is Evaluating Warfare Myths About Science and Christianity. And I'm losing my my video when I do that. So let's see about. So I have the paper downloaded, but it's not showing my camera when I do that. So what we'll do here is look this up and find the paper here. Okay. So we'll just look at the paper like this. All right. So the name of the paper is Evaluating Warfare Myths. I'm stuttering here. Evaluating Warfare Myths About Science and Christianity and How These Myths Promote Scientism. All right. So this is from Dr. Michael Keyes. It was published back in 2021. He is a lecturer at Biola University in California. And let's go through his abstract, and then we will go through, he proposes that there are 4 major myths about this so-called war between science and Christianity. And he wants to point out that these myths promote what is called scientism. So before I read the abstract, let me define some terms here. When we say science, that is not the same thing as scientism, which is what Dr. Coyne is basically referring to. Now, this is a fundamental. It's fundamentally important for us to define terms. So, science is not the same thing as scientism. So, why don't we go? I want to leave his paper open. By the way, inimical, I had to look that up because he uses that term at the bottom. He mentions that Christianity is somehow inimical to science, and inimical means tending to obstruct or harm. By the way, I think I read that at the outset. If you're wondering what that term means, that's what it means. Essentially, that Christianity is hostile or unfriendly or obstructive to the advent and to the progression of science, is what Dr. Coyne argues. It's just that that's a false idea. And we'll see that historically when we look at Dr. Key's paper. But what I wanted to look up was science, so that you don't take my word for it. It's fine for us to just simply look at the AI overview. It defines science as a systematic endeavor that builds and organizes knowledge about the natural and social world through observation and experimentation. This is a pretty good definition. If you think about what the word science, the etymology of the word, it comes from Latin, I believe, that means knowledge. Now, again, don't take my word for it. We're going to go ahead and look it up. What is the etymology of the word science? It is Latin from scire, which means to know. So the word science has to do with knowledge. So if we go back to that definition, it's a systematic endeavor that builds and organizes knowledge about the natural and social world through observation and experimentation. Now, if you think about that, there's nothing in that definition that precludes the belief in the supernatural or the belief in the possibility of the supernatural. In fact, that idea that you can't believe in the possibility of the supernatural is not a scientific idea. It's a philosophical one. And so there's a difference between science and scientism. And so when we're talking about scientism is the idea that this systematic endeavor that builds and organizes knowledge about the natural and social world through observation and experimentation, this science, that is the only way to know anything. And so if you think about that, the idea that science is the only way to come to knowledge about anything that's a philosophy that is called scientism. Again, let's not take my word for it. Let's look up scientism. Scientism is the philosophical position that asserts science is the only valid way to acquire knowledge and that it can provide answers to all significant questions, including those in philosophy, morality, ethics, and religion. So this is what men like Dr. Coyne, this is their philosophical position. And the issue is, if you disagree with this, then they say that you're not a science person. But it's not that you're not a science person. It's not that it is instead that you are not scientistic. You do not believe in scientism. Because the idea that scientism is the only way that you can know a thing, the problem is, let's take something that's intangible, something that is immaterial, like love, for instance. Love is not something you can put in a test tube. Love is not something that you can observe. If we go back to the definition of science, it's not something that's observable in any kind of way that we would call science. And yet there's a way to know about love, whether you have that love for someone else or they have that love for you. There is knowledge there that doesn't have to do with science. And so there are all kinds of things that are immaterial like this that are not something that science can nail down for you. In fact, when you look at some of these historical things that Dr. Coyne is pointing to, that's not science. And he said as much. He said, I can't prove this. So he had this idea that, well, if atheism had been there instead of Christianity, everything would be better. That's the thing that often gets said, that if we just get rid of God, everything will be better. And I think we're seeing socially the fruits of some of this new atheism of the past, of guys like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. And we're seeing all kinds of craziness happening when you take God away. But these people promised that if you took God away, everything would be better. And it's not better. And things aren't improving, even in the science realm, when you take God away. So scientism is what he believes in. So if we go back to the paper, these myths promote scientism. There are myths, I would venture to even call them lies, but we'll call them myths here, about this so-called warfare between science and Christianity. And these myths, what they do instead of actually being true, they actually promote scientism. And they can really push and press believers into thinking that these claims regarding this war between science and Christianity are true, and that you can look at something that's scientifically true, and these people who are proponents of scientism will tell you, well, Christianity opposes all of these things, and it has in the past. And that can cause people who have a shaky faith to think, well, I think I just need to go with the thing that's true. And Christianity is opposing the thing I know to be true from science. So therefore, Christianity itself must be false. So let me go ahead and read the abstract. Many people assume that there has been ceaseless conflict between science and Christianity. I argue that the real conflict has been between scientism and religion. Scientism is the view that only the sciences generate knowledge or rational belief. Scientism, as typically articulated, entails the opinion that reliable belief about divinity, theological realism, is impossible. I debunk 4 historic science Christianity conflict myths and show how they have promoted scientism. These 4 science religion myths function as part of a larger warfare narrative about science and Christianity. This misleading warfare thesis often comes packaged with an alternative anti-theistic myth in the anthropological sense. In this case, a worldview shaping narrative that awakens the imagination to interpret the world in scientistic and non-theistic ways. I call this the scientistic warfare myth and explore its major flaws. Now, that's a mouthful, of course. What he's getting at, if we just kind of distill this down, is that he points out the difference between science, which is what we just did, and scientism, which is the idea that science is the only way to know anything, is the only way to get knowledge in the world. Science is one way to know things, but it's not the only way to know things. And you can't scientifically justify scientism. That's the really interesting thing about it. In some ways, it's self-defeating. You can't use science to justify scientism. You have to begin by just saying, well, I'm going to believe that the only way to learn things, the only way to know things is through science. Okay, but you can't use science to know that thing. So it's self-defeating. So, but never mind that. What he has here are these 4 myths, and that's what we're going to spend a few minutes on. And again, we're keeping the podcast a little shorter now, so we'll spend a few minutes on these 4 myths, and then we'll wrap up for today. So here are the 4 myths. The first myth is the dark myth. And this is the idea, which is what you saw from Dr. Coyne in his paper earlier, that there was this 1,000 years where there was no science being done. And if Christianity was so helpful, then why wasn't there any science being done for that 1,000 years? The idea that there was no science being done for 1,000 years, that there was a period called the Dark Ages, is actually, by any reputable historian of science today, known to be false. There's no such thing as the Dark Ages. Now, that might be surprising to you, that this period that sometimes we'll call it the Middle Ages, which that's fine, but to call it the Dark Ages is a misnomer and borderline lie, because there were many things that we can point to that really led to the rise of the explosion of science, which means that it wasn't that there was no science being done during the Middle Ages. It's just that, again, there is this lie being told that during this time where Christianity was so influential, there was no science being done. It's not true. And so we'll look at some of the details that Dr. Keyes gets into for a second, but let me just outline the 4 myths first. So the dark myth, that there was this 1,000-year period of dark ages, not true. The second myth is the flat myth, that basically people that were believers just didn't know anything about the earth being round until Columbus figured it out in 1492. False. It'll be really interesting because, again, you would think, if you think about all of these, if you're a believer, you might not realize, because you've probably heard these things, but they're actually false. It is not true that believers didn't understand that the earth was round. It's just not true. The third thing, the idea that the universe being this vast, this huge entity, right? The universe being big is somehow problematic for Christianity. And now I know that one gets said. I'm not really sure why that would be a problem. We'll look at what Dr. Keyes has to say about it, but um, the universe being big, uh, it's interesting. There's this song that the kids sing during Vacation Bible School. My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. So the idea that the God who made the universe being huge, is somehow in it just being this really vast expanse. The idea that that is somehow anti Christian, or it's going to be a problem for people who are believers, is something that sometimes atheists will say. I'm not sure why that would be a problem. It would just again point to the how great God is. The fourth myth is what Dr. Keyes calls the demotion myth, and what that has to do with is that when Copernicus points out that the our solar system centers basically around the sun rather than around the earth, that somehow demoted the earth and therefore mankind, because everybody apparently thought that the earth was in the middle of everything. Now again, well, we'll get into the details in a second. So those are the four myths: the dark myth, the flat myth, the big myth, and the demotion myth. And to me, we'll spend the majority of our time on the dark and the flat, because you probably have not heard this, that one, that there's really no such thing as the dark ages. You can call it the middle ages, but the idea of it being the dark ages, it being a period of time where science was not being done, and and because Christianity was basically stamping out any scientific breakthroughs, is just not true. And then the second one being that it took Columbus to figure out that the earth was round, is just not true. And so those are the two ones I want to focus on, but the other ones we'll mention as well. Okay, so notice here that Dr. Keyes quotes Jerry Coyne, and he says, "Had there been no Christianity, if after the fall of Rome, atheism had pervaded the Western world, science would have developed earlier and be far more advanced than it is now." Now, we looked at this quote at the beginning of the podcast, and the quote comes directly from that article. You'll notice that Dr. Keyes actually is being merciful to Dr. Coyne, because if you remember, we read this. What he says is, I can't prove this. Let's go back to it. What he says here is, I maintain, though I can't prove this, that had there been no Christianity, if after the fall of Rome. So the entire quote is, I maintain, though I can't prove this. And that's exactly right, because he cannot prove this. What he simply says is, had there been no Christianity, if after the fall of Rome, atheism had pervaded the Western world. So that first part, it's interesting that Dr. Keyes doesn't put that in there, because that really is what he said. I'm saying this, but I can't really justify it, because, and you certainly can't apply any science to it. So he says this, and so what Dr. Keyes does is he points out that instead of it being dark ages for 1,000 years, you can find that from 400 to roughly 1100 BC or AD, 400 to 1100 AD, you have Saint Augustine, who does some things that are related to science. He contributes to what's called Aristotelian physics, so it's referring to Aristotle. In his commentary, there is a monk who wrote about astronomy in the 600s and 700s AD. Then you go to the 1100s to the to roughly 1450, and you have people who are reasoning their way to certain principles, and there are universities that are invented during this period. So again, many of these people who are atheists or evolutionists are working out of the university. The university originated during the Dark Ages. So it's really interesting to think about how someone who is benefiting from the existence of universities that originated during what they're calling the Dark Ages, but you're in a university and that originated during the Dark Ages. So what does that say about your endeavors out of the university? is a really interesting thing to think about. So if these ages were so dark, then how do they come up with this invention that continues to the present time? But these people weren't doing any science. Now, if you say that you're doing science today out of the university, you can thank those who originated the university during the Middle Ages. So it's really interesting to think about the way universities operated during that time. And so they would so there again, during this medieval period, there was science being done, and a lot of it was happening in the universities, and a lot of this science that was growing field was out of universities. And you would have cities that would want the universities to be there, and you'd have scholars that would be learning during the in these universities. So one of the things that Dr. Keyes says at the end of this section is that instead of labeling this as the so-called dark ages, it would be much better to call this the age of illumination, because you think about these universities. One of the things he mentions earlier is that if you look at the curriculum in the university, about 30% of it would be what we would call STEM today: science, tech, well, not technology, but science and mathematics would be in there. So 30% of their curriculum was that. Now that's a lot for this being dark ages, and these people don't know anything about science. And so they were learning. There was a lot of translation of things into Latin. And so this the Latin was the language that the educated of that time would read from. So all of these things were happening in the so-called dark ages. So you have to understand why this myth is important to these people. I'm not saying that Dr. Coyne is purposely lying about this. I think whoever originated these myths, they are likely lying, or just they're not clear on what had occurred, and so they just made it up. So again, either way, it's not based on what historically happened. And it's interesting when you go and you come across other historians of science, they are a little bit baffled by this. I know in my comments in the past that I did come across a lot of people that when I would just simply say, as a matter of fact, that science came about from believers, that I would get this pushback. And that pushback is from ignorance. It's not, and I don't say that to disparage anybody. It's just you actually just don't know the history. If you knew the history, you would not be saying these things. And so what happens is you hear somebody like Dr. Coyne say this, and you assume that he knows the history, but he doesn't either. And so he's just repeating the same myths over and over again. There were no dark ages. There were no dark ages. There was an age of illumination, is what Dr. Keyes would call it, but not dark ages. That's where we got universities, and we still use them hundreds of years later. We still have this thing called the university, it's really interesting. We have something that we would call Christian universities now, but there was nothing but universities where people believed in Jesus Christ back then. That it would be a tautology. It would not a tautology. It would be a repetition, an unnecessary repetition to call a university a Christian university back then, because there were no unchristian or non-Christian universities. Everybody believed in Jesus Christ. So this is the interesting thing about it. And now we've gotten to a place where so-called secular universities are considered the norm, and universities that would be affiliated with religion or with Christ specifically you have to put an adjective on it. That's whatever you want to say about that. Okay, so the other one that I wanted to spend a little time on, I'm running out of time today, is the flat myth. This idea that's propagated, he mentions here, by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has a lot of things to say that he doesn't realize or understand what he's saying. He is clearly ignorant about the early history of science here. So it was he mentions here that back in 2016, Tyson wrote that you're 5 centuries behind if you believe in a flat earth, to this rapper B.O.B. And someone responded and said, what do you mean 5 centuries? People knew about this more than 5 centuries ago. And then Tyson says, well, yeah, some ancient Greeks knew about it, but it was lost to the Dark Ages. Now, again, Tyson is going along with the myth of the Dark Ages. There's no such thing as the Dark Ages. There's the Middle Ages. And what we just mentioned and what we just saw from what Dr. Keyes pointed out briefly is that you'd be better off calling it an age of illumination rather than the Dark Ages. So here's the thing. You actually don't have to go back very far to find where this lie began. Dr. Keyes says here that Tyson's false ideas have a history. They trace back to writers in the 1800s. The 19th century chemist historian claimed that John William Draper, he claimed that medieval Christians believed the scriptures contain the sum of all knowledge. They therefore discouraged any investigation of nature, including the study of the earth's shape. Supposedly, this ignorance continued until the time of Columbus. So what's interesting is, so it was some guy in the 1800s that basically said that the medieval Christians were these backward people who didn't know anything about the shape of the earth, and they never even investigated it. So again, that's just not true. And what's interesting is, if I were to ask you, and again, I'm no astronomy buff myself, but if I were to ask you, how do you prove that the earth is round? I didn't learn anything about that in school. And so one of the things that Dr. Keyes points out here is that the same is true for his students, that we think we're so educated today. But the interesting thing about it is that if you were to ask college students today, how would you prove that the earth is round? Most students today would just say, well, just look at the NASA pictures or something like that, right? And frankly, if I thought about it, I could probably give an answer. But one of the things that he mentions is that most of them were unaware that people knew that the earth was round well before Columbus. And so he mentions that in 1300, if you were a student in a university in Spain, you would have studied about Aristotle arguing that the earth was spherical, and you would then have to demonstrate it. And you would basically use your understanding of the positions of the North Star and look at its location in relation to the horizon, and go to a different position and see that position is different when you're in a different place on the earth, and that change of angle would be how you would show that the earth must be round. One of the things that Dr. Keyes points out is, he, as a lecturer, when he asks his students the same thing, he says, my students have typically been less able to defend the earth's roundness by such scientific arguments than the average medieval student. Meaning that you go back 700 years ago, and university students back then could easily say, oh, this is how you would show that the earth is round. Ask a university student in an astronomy class today, how do you know that the earth is round? They're not going to be able to tell you that. And so what's interesting is this idea, again, that, well, it was the Dark Ages. No, students in university students, college students back then could tell you exactly why they could show you scientifically why the earth was round. And science students today often are not in a position to do that. So this is devastating to this idea, this myth of, well, it took Columbus to figure out that the earth was round, and all the people who were believers thought the earth was flat, but they didn't think the earth was flat. And in fact, they were teaching in universities that the earth was round and showing how you can show it well before Columbus was born. So again, this is a myth. This is a myth to try to portray people who were believers 700, 800, 900 years ago as being backward somehow, when that's not the case at all. And so this scientific foundation that explodes when you get to the 16, 1700s was building steadily over time. And you have things like universities, and you have people doing research, and you have people doing science, and it builds. And when you have the explosion of modern science in the 16 and 1700s, then that is because of the foundations being built and cultivated over time. The last two myths again are the big myth, the idea that a large universe is a problem for Christianity. It isn't. If we believe in a if we believe in a God who has infinite power, strength, intelligence, wisdom, then having a vast universe that's far beyond what we can fathom is not a difficulty at all for us. And then finally, well, I'll mention this briefly. It's interesting that C.S. Lewis points out that this idea of the atheist saying, "Well, what we would expect is this," is always this is always an interesting thing, because if we look out into the universe and there's a bunch of space and there's not much that's filled in, you'll have atheists that say, "Well, see, a God wouldn't just create all that space with nothing filled in." But then if it had a bunch of stuff in it, the same atheist or someone else would turn around and say, "Well, see, a God wouldn't create that huge space and fill it up with all of that stuff." And so there's never really, no matter what evidence you show, they're always going to say, "Well, God wouldn't do that." We see this often when I encounter people that want to tell me that the human body hasn't been designed. They'll say something like the eye is weird and it's backward the way it's wired, or they'll look at something like the ankle or the knee, and well, people tearing their ACLs, a good an all knowing God wouldn't create bodies like this that tear up so easily. And once again, this betrays the fact that it doesn't matter what kind of body you show these people, they're going to tell you, "Well, it couldn't be God that did it." And so there's nothing you can show someone who is opposed to the idea of God. There's nothing you can show them that would somehow change their mind. There's no evidence that you can point them to, because they've already made up their mind before they see any evidence. And that's basically what C.S. Lewis gets at. It's interesting that Dr. Keyes mentions that here. Okay. The final myth is the demotion myth. Copernicus demotes humans from the cosmic center. The interesting thing about that is it's really an anachronistic idea. Anachronistic means something that's out of its time. So it would be like talking about, if we've mentioned Copernicus. If we said something like Copernicus was on his cell phone, you would say, well, Copernicus couldn't be on a cell phone because cell phones hadn't been invented yet. That's an anachronism. The idea that it would have been problematic for humans not being in the cosmic center of things is an anachronism. We think of things as being in the center. That's not how people thought about them back then. And so this idea of taking the earth from being in the center and, oh, that's a problem, and because God, according to these people, God would have placed humans and the earth at the center of the universe rather than somewhere else. What you realize when you read the history is that Galileo, over 100 years, well, it says here, in the century after Copernicus, he wrote, "I will prove that the earth does have motion, and that it is not the sump where the universe's filth and ephemera collect." He framed his argument as a promotion, not a demotion, for earth and its inhabitants. You see, the idea, according to the geocentric view of the earth, was that the earth was at the bottom of the universe. That the earth was at the bottom and that heaven is up from there. Now, what that means is this idea of taking the earth from the center wasn't even the way these people thought. It's really a modern thought being imposed on them which is how all of these myths are. We're kind of taking modern thinking and we're imposing it on them, and that's not how they even thought. So the idea that Copernicus, fig- who who really basically showed that the universe is not geocentric, it's or the solar system is not geocentric, meaning Earth in the center. It is heliocentric. The sun's in the center, and everything's revolving around it. The idea that that's a problem is again a myth. So there's a bunch of other stuff that he says here that we're not going to get into, but about Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan. But the bottom line is that these are mythologies. These are stories that get told, and they fascinate people. And sometimes they can seep into the thinking of believers. So we have to be careful about what we are being told about the history of science, because many of these things are myths that capture the imagination of people who are materialists and atheists, and it causes them to speak ill of believers from the past. But what we see here is that believers were not some backward people. It was because of believers that science rose. And so we could go to some Bible scriptures that talk about the roundness of the earth, for instance, and various other science ideas. But the Bible is not a science book, but there's plenty there in it that tell us how things came to be. And there's nothing in it that alludes to something that opposes science. Now, it's going to oppose scientism because there are other things that can be known outside of science, plenty of other things. And so we will maybe talk about more of those things sometime. So that's it for today. These four myths. Hopefully, if you didn't know that the Dark Ages are not a thing, maybe that's helpful for you. If you didn't know that there were plenty of believers that knew the Earth was round well before Columbus, then knowing that kind of is helpful, and being able to understand that there are more myths than just the evolution myth. That's one of them, but there are all kinds of other little myths, and a lot of times these myths will have people thinking that Christianity is opposed to science. It's not. Science rose because of Christianity. Universities were invented from people who were believers. So these kinds of ideas, we need to make sure we understand them so that when people say things that aren't true, like in the case of Dr. Coyne in his article there, that we can politely push back and say, well, where's your evidence for that? Where's your evidence that atheism would have been better? Well, the truth is there isn't any. That atheism builds on, it needed that soil of Christianity, and then all it is a critique. But in and of itself, hasn't built anything. It hasn't come up with anything. It's only borrowing from what believers already came up with. So that's it for today's show. Till next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.